Yes. But now let's turn to today. And let's come to Ian. Did you ever go to our university books and articles on the youth search function and had a look at Ian Rowen? Actually, I found 74 entries, but of course part of them is double. And one of your major books is also each chapter has an
Oh, how nice.
Yeah, which is great. When I decided on the classes I would like to teach this term, I found Ian's book, the book you edited on transitional justice, which we actually use in class.
Fantastic.
We use quite a lot. So, classes, different classes, but they all go to the short stories. So probably easier to read for students.
Yes.
I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, we do use this book, which we have as an online complete version, so everybody can at home at night, if you do not feel bored or whatever, you can go to the university internet and have a look at Ian's book collection, the collection he edited on white terror stories, all translated into English. Actually, the last thing we tried to find the original Taiwanese author, but couldn't.
Which do you remember which story?
The last one I tried is
the final author is Wu He. Yeah, I think he's still around. I've not met him myself, but I know he's.
But you know.
I've not met him, but he is notorious for unusual behavior. Like he disappeared for many years, something like 10 years. He hid away in a mountain writing. So I wouldn't be surprised if he's unreachable.
Introducing this short story, he said he only could use your introduction to find something about Wu He, but couldn't find anymore.
I'm surprised. Michael Berry has translated a whole book by Wu He, and I haven't read there must be an introduction where there's some biographical data, but there's certainly a lot written in Chinese about him.
I thought that this colleague who is Chinese would probably die.
Well, I'm glad the introduction was useful.
There is this very important book on short stories of the White Terror period, but there are also other books on cross-strait relations and on cross-strait tourism. So Ian has many specific knowledges, including geopolitical. That's what you studied at university.
Yeah, my PhD was in geography, which included geopolitics, but also cultural politics more broadly. Political geography, cultural geography. Yeah.
It's very good to see your development now from geography to geopolitics. Is probably
lots of swerving.
Interesting, interesting movement. Anyway, if you go to USearch, you are going to find Ian's articles, including civil society and, for instance, the Sunflower Movement. And comparisons with Hong Kong. So there is also much to read about Hong Kong, about a comparison between Taiwan, Hong Kong, and not the mainland. The third place
Japan.
Comparison was Japan.
Yeah, the youth activism article or chapter in a Routledge handbook on civil society in Asia, and it compares Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Japan.
So the third one was Japan. No, the book I also found had Macau. It had Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau.
Very briefly, that's a different chapter entirely. Yeah.
That is another book, but anyway, Macau is also mentioned. So interestingly, all could be compared. These. there is one book that you should read, also available in our university as an online version. It's called One China, Many Taiwans. Yeah. And I think we could take this book as one term's mandatory lecture for everybody, so that everybody would read that book. We can then, after having read the book, they could probably possibly invite you again.
That would be great fun. I look forward to that. Yeah.
There is a homepage, and the homepage is very easy to find because it's simply the name, Rowen and com.
Yeah.
So if you are interested in further information, go to that homepage and look at it. You did your PhD that we just mentioned at the University of Colorado in Boulder in 2016.
Yes.
And afterwards, he had a period of time in Singapore, and from Singapore came to Taiwan, to the National Taiwan Normal University, and teaching literature,
culture, language, and literature.
Yeah. With a huge chapter. My introduction is finished. We welcome you very much, and as you can see, the room is for this day and time is rather full.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah, and welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be in such a beautiful campus and city. I'm actually, before I start, I'd like to know a little more about the room. This is a undergraduate class?
No, this is
postgraduate class, lecture,
two BA classes and one master.
Wow. Okay, so 3 classes all together, and part of a general lecture series. Ho Ming Tai was here, for example, recently, in the same room.
No, actually, my classes are all very small.
Okay.
And they are all in the neighboring room.
Okay.
We couldn't fit into that room.
Okay. Oh.
Only from time 9 to 12.
Okay. Okay, no, this is wonderful. I'm glad to speak to such a full room on a weeknight. It's amazing. People would come out at 6:30. My students would be home by now. Also, before I continue, how many of us have spent time? How many of us are from Taiwan? Maybe grew up in Taiwan. Many of us have spent more than how many of us have been to Taiwan for at least a day or two? All right. Okay, great. And we've all probably heard of the White Terror, the 228 incident, and martial law at some point. Okay, good. So I'm not going to go over too many of the specifics of that period, but I will talk a bit about how it was represented and how that's been transitioning as part of larger projects. So just a little bit more about me before I continue. I first went to Taiwan in the year 2000. It was the year that Chen Shui-bian was elected. So I had been a student of Chinese language in Hong Kong, which I started doing on a whim as an undergraduate. And I saw such excitement among my classmates, my dorm mates, and even some of my teachers who were teaching Mandarin, but attempting to teach. The Taiwanese teachers were trying to teach themselves how to speak Mandarin in a Beijing accent. And suddenly, when Chen Shui-bian was elected in 2000, there was this explosion of sentiment, of excitement, a feeling Taiwan was entering a new era. And it wasn't just Taiwan, there was this general enthusiasm around the region. While in Hong Kong, in the year 2000, Hong Kong had just been handed to the PRC 3 years earlier from Britain. And there was a general sense, I felt at the time, of apathy, a sense of political coldness, of estrangement, of a disinterest in political activity. Most of my classmates were more interested in becoming management consultants or bankers. And I saw among Taiwanese this sense of excitement about civil society, about democratization, social movements, and so on. And so I moved to Taiwan soon after that, spent 4 years there, lived in China for a few years after that, the Philippines, and then graduate school, where I designed my research to think about China and Taiwan relations through encounters, through interpersonal encounters, including tourism. which brought me in contact again with social movements. So I didn't just write about the Sunflower Movement, for example, I actually joined it as a participant. And that is in some ways what led to this project. And that movement also in some ways is what led to this interesting project. In 2016, and this is how I opened the first article I wrote about transitional justice, and it's how this particular performance is how President Tsai Ing-wen opened her whole presidency. I was not there to see this in person, but it's a really quite striking video. I recommend you watch this sometime to see how President Tsai, on her very first day in office, May 20th, 2016, staged Taiwan's 400, if one wants to bind Taiwan history in a way that is at least legible in writing, 400 years of history into about 40 minutes of a stage show. And this took place in front of the presidential office in Ketagalan Boulevard, where inauguration ceremonies always take place, and not just inauguration ceremonies, but also protests, because it's kind of the fulcrum of the nation. And so it begins in 1683 and earlier with a bunch of indigenous attired indigenous people, but counted, enumerated according to contemporary Taiwan's conventions of counting and naming indigenous people, staging the arrival of the Dutch, the arrival or the naming of Taiwan as Formosa by the Portuguese, the expulsion of the Dutch by Zheng Tanggong in the southwest, the arrival of the Qing dynasty, their claims to Taiwan, the arrival of endless amounts of Han settlers from Fujian province and elsewhere, and followed, of course, by the handover to Japan in 1895, the resumption, the so-called retrocession, in which Taiwan was again handed, in this case, to the Republic of China in 1945. Stages of violence are being represented here, imagery of bayonets, of guns, of great violence due to the repression that followed, as I'll narrate very briefly, followed by yet more decades of white terror, and then finally a happy story of democratization, a happy story of reconciliation, a happy story of Taiwan as a contemporary, multicultural, perhaps multilingual, multiracial place. You see images of Vietnamese brides. You see Taiwan is a happy, prosperous society, all staged in this incredible 40-minute show, which is problematic in all kinds of ways if one wants to get critical about its portrayal of ethnicity, nationality, and so on, but sets a cultural tone for understanding the policy making that was to follow, because as she announced in a speech immediately after this ceremony, immediately after this performance, she announced a very ambitious agenda to pursue something called transitional justice, which she announced as a lawyer. She had some inkling, I think, of this as a institutional practice, but not that much deep research, certainly not as much as in trade law or other kinds of expertise. And what she announced in this speech was a pursuit of transitional justice. And the goal of this, she said, was to pursue true social reconciliation, so that all Taiwanese can take to heart the mistakes of that era. And what she was referring to was the era of the Republic of China as handed over in 1945. She wasn't so much taking responsibility for what happened prior to that. She was taking responsibility as the president of the ROC on Taiwan. You see how even I confuse these terms. And specifically, what she, I think, had in mind, it wasn't quite clear, and this is why I bracket this word authoritarian. What she was most likely addressing was the originary scar, the originary foundation of modern Taiwanese consciousness, at least as so many scholars have written. I won't recapitulate this history in great detail, except to say, as a reminder, in 1947, February 27th, a female cigarette vendor was struck by police, launching a rebellion of Taiwanese who were who had felt dismayed, disappointed, displaced, dislocated, and oppressed by the arrival of nationalist troops, which 2 years earlier had been celebrated as some kind of retrocession, some resumption of a rule by a common people rather than an explicitly colonial power, which had then turned very sour in the lives of everyday Taiwanese people. An uprising took place across the island. There were hopes to negotiate some kind of settlement, moving towards some kind of self-rule, autonomy, perhaps even democracy. Yet this was met with the arrival of forces coming in from China, a massacre of quite likely 10,000-ish people. It's hard to know for sure. Probably the most impartial account of this is in this book by Stephen Phillips, Between Assimilation and Independence. And then 2 years later, the announcement of martial law and the instantiation of the White Terror, which led to 38 years of martial law, the longest period of martial law in world history until Syria has now taken the crown. Now, I have an image here. Just keep these gunfires and these locked up people in the back of your mind. You'll see a similar image towards the end of today's talk. I take this from the 228 Museum, again, just to show examples of the way this has been represented. If you want more history, again, see this book. And otherwise, how else has it been represented? So a wonderful book, if you've not seen, by Sylvia Li Junling, who's also a translator, in fact, a translator of two of the stories that I'll be talking about a bit later when I get to the edited volume that Astrid so kindly was plugging, has written a great book. This is nearly 20 years old now, I think, who posits that soon after the 228 incident in 1947, there were some attempts to account for what happened, some ways of writing about it. She thinks of this as a first period of representing atrocity. There were some short stories, but they were mostly buried. It was very, very dangerous to write about these things in the late 40s and 50s. It might get you thrown into prison or executed. In the 1980s, as Taiwan saw waves of social movements, Taiwan was still formally under martial law, but there were at least new parties kind of in the wings waiting, people taking stabs at new forms of expression. There were new stories being written to account for this, as well as attempts in cinema. Later, the most famous being Ho Xiaoxian's City of Sadness, a classic film, which narrates 228 by not narrating it. It happens entirely out of the frame. It's a very clever way of talking about something that had been unspeakable until quite recently before the film was made. After the end of martial law in 1987, there is then a flurry of new production, both in cinema and in literature. And then by the mid-2000s, and this is around the time that Sylvia Lin is writing this book, Sylvia Lin suggests, and she tentatively posits here, that there's an awareness that it might be very hard to capture truth as it happened impartially, right? Everyone has an agenda. People's memories are always partial. It's hard to know what's going on. There'd been a great deal of excitement in the late 80s and 90s about truth. And truth is a very, very seductive concept, right? It's seductive for just about everyone. Perhaps not psychoanalysts. I just went to the Sigmund Freud Museum earlier today, and it's a good place to think about truth a bit differently, but it's a very seductive endeavor for social scientists, storytellers, activists, and policymakers. And this leads to, I think, a series of efforts within Taiwan among sociologists and activists to account for what had happened and to make not just inquiry into the facts of the matter, but also to seek reparations, perhaps to speak not just retributive justice, punishing the perpetrators, but also restoration, in some ways making the families of the victims whole, of exonerating the victims, of making amends, and so on. And so there were a number of scholars, including the sociologist Wu Naida, and others who formed a NGO in 2007 called the Taiwan Association for Truth and Reconciliation. And this was a group of scholars and activists that took cues from efforts in South Africa, efforts in other post-authoritarian or post-apartheid states to account for the sins of the past, to air grievances, and to pursue reconciliation in some way, and perhaps also to compensate victims. Wu Naida wrote the very first piece about efforts toward transitional justice in Taiwan, at least the very first piece in English, incidentally in the very first issue of the Taiwan Journal for Democracy in July 2005, in which he argued that Taiwan's famously and perhaps justly celebrated bloodless democratic transition, and this is rare, right? It's hard to think of many other polities where you had a state as authoritarian as the ROC on Taiwan that transitioned to such a vibrant multi-party democracy without not just mass protests, but really serious state violence. It's hard to think of many other examples, but in the process, Wu Naida argued, there was really no effort to come to terms with who had committed these crimes. Basically, there was a preference at all levels of society, given so much complicity of all classes, and also so much repression and oppression, and an unwillingness to open these wounds again, that celebrated transition to democracy actually forestalled other forms of knowing, other ways of getting along that might resolve these deeper conflicts in Taiwanese society. And so he called for Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It would be somewhat along the lines of South Africa. It might also be willing to more directly intervene in other distortions in Taiwan's democratic system. For example, the fact that the KMT, the Chinese Nationalist Party, was still at that time, and until in fact 2016 or 2017, the richest political party in the world with billions of dollars in assets swirled around the whole world. This has only been seized in the last few years, quite controversially. And so following this landmark article in 2005, there was all of one other article on transitional justice in the next 10 years until the inauguration ceremony and speech I just mentioned happened, and I decided to call up my sister, who incidentally is an expert in transitional justice. Her first book here, Searching for Truth in the Transitional Justice Movement, is based on a comparative analysis of South Africa, Colombia, and the United States, which has not had and will not have a transitional justice movement. So she's asking as much why countries do this as why they not. And so I gave her a call soon after Tsai made this speech and announced an intention of setting up these commissions and suggested we collaborate. So it was quite a pleasure to learn from her about a bit more about transitional justice, and for her to learn from me a bit more about Taiwan. And as we analyzed Tsai's speech and we thought about its implications, and we also thought about her larger agenda, we speculated that Tsai wasn't just out for what we might call reconciliation. It wasn't just a domestic policy agenda. It was actually part of a larger global approach to repositioning Taiwan in international representative bodies and so on. And thinking about transitional justice from a somewhat more constructivist approach, not thinking of it in necessarily an idealistic or normative way, we think about transitional justice empirically. How has it actually operated in the world as a concept? How has it been put to use? And so we were cautiously optimistic this might work out, but we didn't take it for granted that it was somehow a perfect and good way of doing things. In fact, we argued that transitional justice in theory and practice is a malleable and often ambiguous idea. And this has made it very attractive to all kinds of actors, not just in Taiwan, but elsewhere, pursuing often very, very different goals, often at cross ends. And it has very variable effects. In fact, you might be pursuing reconciliation, but actually aggravating contradiction and difference. It's very, very hard to determine how these things will work out. There's a lot of very complicated social factors, which actually led some of Taiwan's most, I think, hopeful and optimistic activists to also be worried that perhaps Taiwan is not ready for such a process. Other people responded, well, if not now, when? This can be indefinitely deferred. There is no real simple template. There's no checklist. There's no way you can go and say what is the best practice for transitional justice. After the kind of popular reception of what was done in South Africa, there were a number of foundation-supported agencies and think tanks to support the proliferation of transitional justice around the world. These took the form of NGOs based in New York, in Switzerland, and elsewhere that served consulting roles for different polities. Taiwan didn't really contract with such people. In fact, by the time Taiwan took this on in the 2016, 2017, that kind of wave of transitional justice as a global social movement had already crested. Not so much in Asia, but elsewhere. Within Asia, there have been some efforts in South Korea. There's now an effort underway in Nepal. There have been some efforts between East Timor and Indonesia to pursue this. But as a global social movement, it's not straightforward. So a way we conceive of it, a way we theorize it was as a way to achieve trans-regime legitimacy, which is to say, Tsai had promised she would not change the name of the Republic of China. She promised she would not change the constitution. She would maintain most tools of the state apparatus she was inheriting. That was also recognizably to her and many of her most ardent supporters illegitimate. It was actually inheriting decades of violence. So Tsai had to somehow find a way to legitimize her own regime while also making amends for the sins of its past. And it's not necessarily so much that Tsai and her wing of the DPP are fans of the Republic of China. its symbolism, its history, and so on. But this was an election promise meant to soothe concerned voters and also meant to soothe the neighbor across the strait in China that has passed an anti-secession law in 2006, promising to invade Taiwan should its name be changed, should its constitution be changed, and so on. And so for this reason, we speculated that Tsai wasn't just concerned with forging a shared understanding about authoritarian state violence in the early years of the ROC. And this kind of domestic goal is laudable, right? There's a lot of different opinions about what happened, and a lot of confusion, and a lot of repressed memories, and a lot of archives that had not been tapped. In fact, archives that were sealed behind closed doors, and that it took the force of law and police to unseal. But was also meant to perform kind of a cultural and political distinction from the authoritarianism of the People's Republic of China, right? So as we all know, in 1989, there was a mass incidence of state violence in Beijing in which thousands of people were killed after protests in Tiananmen Square. A year after that, Taiwan incidentally had also a student protest, the Wild Lily movement, that was handled very differently. And this was a way that one could see that the ROC and the PRC were diverging. Now, in 2016, if Tsai can call for transitional justice, if Taiwan can undertake this kind of activity, meanwhile, China under Xi Jinping is getting more and more repressive. The difference between Taiwan and China is that much more obvious, not just to Taiwanese voters, but to the whole world. Taiwan is performing in a way in line with international norms of democracy and human rights, right? This will boost Taiwan's global profile. So the argument here that again, it's speculative, was that the TRC, or the Transitional Justice Commission, was meant to be not just for Taiwan's domestic market, so to speak, but also part of a larger geopolitical strategy. It was, of course, compromised by these constraints I just mentioned, not to change the so-called status quo, not that the status quo is static, status quo meaning the relationship between Taiwan and China, in which both sides are a bit cagey about who is who and what is what and who claims who. It turns out that this agenda has been really challenged by all kinds of domestic political challenges. So there were some really significant achievements in 2016, and these are not without controversy. One of the first acts of transitional justice was the passage of an Illicit Assets Act. So this was targeting properties, monies, businesses that had been nationalized or appropriated directly by the KMT when they arrived and took over from the Japanese colonial regime. This was meant to even the playing field and also to correct for past distortions that were affecting Taiwan's elections. This caused all kinds of backlash, as I'll mention on the next slide. And then more germane to today's talk, the passage of the Transitional Justice Act and the establishment of a Transitional Justice Commission by the Executive Yuan. So the best legislative history of this would be Ernest Caldwell's piece in the 2018 Washington International Law Journal. This is open access. It's got a very nice history written by a trained lawyer, which was so inspiring, I think, to many other legal scholars that it led in 2019 to a whole special issue in response to Caldwell, including a piece of mine, which the points of which I'll address shortly. But it's got a response to the implication I just pointed out of some scholars that Taiwan is simply not ready to do transitional justice. You can see right here in the title of one of these authors, Never Too Late, the work of the Transitional Justice Commission in Taiwan, or perhaps Never Too Early. So this is in 2019, number 3. So I encourage you to take a look at this if you're interested in these outcomes. So soon after the Transitional Justice Act was announced, soon after the commission was announced, the KMT, I think quite predictably, claimed that they were being unfairly targeted. And they used some very colorful language to do so, evoking the language of the White Terror. They called this Green Terror, green being the party color, the DPP and its allies. This was extraordinary. They called it fascist. And they called the passage of these acts the darkest hours of Taiwan's democracy. This is quite striking given the KMT's own behavior over the decades, but again, it's not that surprising. They're a political party like any other. And they made a whole lot of very interesting posters to this effect. And they were helped along by really some disastrous moves of the TJC, the commission's own appointees. So Tsai attempted to square the circle of Taiwan's fractious polity by appointing a politician who had worked on both sides of the aisle, so to speak. Someone who had been the head of the Control Yuan, someone who had kind of a Green or DPP background, but had worked for years with the KMT, but someone who had no real background in transitional justice, someone who hadn't studied this at all, appointed this person, and then appointed a vice chair who spoke very intemperately and imprudently in a what he thought was just a secret conversation where he flippantly suggested that Hou Youyi, who is currently running for president of the KMT and was then and still is the mayor of New Taipei City, should be one of the first people to be targeted by the Transitional Justice Commission for his past role in the immolation of Nailan Deng, the publisher who had called for Taiwan independence in the 1980s and was investigated for treason and committed suicide. So when a staffer of this commission leaked this recording, which was probably flippant, it shouldn't have been said, he probably wasn't serious, it appeared that the calls against the commission were justified. It appeared that actually there was reason to suspect that the commission was unfairly targeting the KMT. And if one reads the legislation, it's not hard to suggest that, in fact, if you're calling for corrections to distortion to Taiwan's party politics, but the bill is directed only at one party based on the way it's written, it's hard not to start having your own suspicions as well. And so this led to the resignation of both the chair and the vice chair, the kind of defanging and detoothing of the commission, even though it was empowered with all kinds of abilities to open archives, to call for restitution, to conduct all kinds of investigations, really a wide range of powers. It suddenly had very limited credibility. And it was then reconstituted with entirely new members who, to their credit, knew a lot more about transitional justice, but were no longer had the political capital to do all that much. And in fact, it led to a time when people didn't want to talk about transitional justice very much at all. I'll return to what they were actually able to get done with the publishing of a report earlier this year, a bit later in the presentation. At the same time, an extremely consequential decision was made, I think problematically, to divide the transitional justice measures for addressing the White Terror and martial law from measures for addressing indigenous dispossession and other forms of oppression that Taiwan's indigenous people have suffered. So quite significantly, in August 2016, so just several months after our inauguration, Tsai made the very first apology to Taiwan's indigenous people in history of the ROC. So these are things that should be familiar to people who've looked at indigenous history in Canada, in Australia, and other settler colonies where leaders have apologized for displacement, dislocation, child kidnapping, and acts of genocide. That Tsai did this on behalf of Taiwan's leadership towards indigenous people is quite significant. She also called for the establishment of an Indigenous Historical Justice and Transitional Justice Commission. So using similar tools, similar language, similar rhetoric, similar policy measures, but executed very differently. So the Transitional Justice Commission was established by an act of the Executive Yuan after a passage in Parliament, the Legislative Yuan. So it was empowered in all kinds of ways. However, the Indigenous Commission was set up under the presidential office. That might sound in some ways more supported, right? It's coming from the highest level of Taiwan's government. But by being under the presidential office, it was actually less empowered. If it worked with more agencies, it would be able to do rather more. Instead, it was mired for several years actually in figuring out exactly who to appoint from which groups and so on. So it was divided and somewhat weakened from the beginning. And for this reason, as well as a refusal really to address pre-ROC sins that had taken place under the Japanese regime, in which most confiscations of indigenous land had been made, in which what's responsible now for example, ancestral indigenous lands belonging to the forestry department rather than indigenous communities, which has led to indigenous people being unable to hunt on their own lands. The ability to really redress that was not baked into the policy from the beginning. And so for this reason, people who had supported Tsai, people who'd sang at her inauguration, including the Amis singer Banai, pictured here in a photo I took at, I think she'd been moved from Ketagalan Boulevard's protest grounds to 228 Park, accused her of betraying her promises. She suggested actually that the Tsai administration was a step backwards from previous TPP efforts to redress indigenous dispossession. So I do think that despite these missteps, there's some really significant things that happen with indigeneity and transitional justice. So in December 2018, the Transitional Justice Commission, and this is the one empowered by the Executive Yuan, exonerated 1,505 people for wrongful convictions. These included 27 indigenous people. So this is quite a significant maneuver. And this exoneration was marked by a Daya indigenous ceremony attended by the then Vice President and current Premier Chen Jianren. So indigenous regalia, indigenous ritual was enrolled into the practice of transitional justice, even outside of the remit of the Indigenous Historical Justice Commission. Kind of supporting the claim that I made earlier that this whole program was part of not just a local or domestic policymaking approach, but also part of an internationally aimed approach. This was timed to coincide with the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So again, you can see how the scale of domestic, regional, and international was articulating together, in this case, with an indigenous themed ceremony. And so it was articulated so explicitly that the commission itself said that the Spalai ritual being held at the event with Daya Watantanaga singing a traditional song in the Daya language and blessing the attendants could be understood itself as the pursuit of truth, which is similar to the government's goal of transitional justice. So this is an extraordinary representational claim of articulation, that actually this much older indigenous ceremony was in some ways a predecessor to a current practice of transitional justice. Indigeneity was also enrolled into a rebuke to China's leader, Xi Jinping. So in 2019, and this is at the lowest trough of Tsai Ing-wen's popularity, she had just had a very poor election. The KMT had roared back in local elections against all odds, it seemed, to win a number of mayor races and so on. And in 2019, Xi Jinping handed her a lifeline when he said in a very typical speech that Taiwan is a part of China. He said remarkably that Chinese people don't attack Chinese people, which is incredible for anyone who knows anything about the Chinese Civil War. I mean, how is it that the KMT fled to Taiwan in the first place? And that reunification is a foregone conclusion. So even if Chinese people don't attack Chinese people and Taiwanese are presumably Chinese and Xi Jinping's telling, it's remarkable again that he's still insisting on a threat of force. So who responded actually, I think the most persuasively in Taiwan to this was not only Tsai Ing-wen as president, but actually 26 of the 28 indigenous transitional justice commissioners who released this really extraordinary statement. I want to read just a few lines. I think this is probably the best articulated response I've seen asserting Taiwan's autonomy and self-determination from any party. And by this, I don't mean political party, but any group of people. Quote, Mr. Xi, you do not know us, so you do not know Taiwan. We are the indigenous peoples of Taiwan, and we've lived in Taiwan, our motherland, for more than 6,000 years. We are not the so-called ethnic minorities or 少数民族 within the Chinese nation, 中华民族. Taiwan is the sacred land where generations of our ancestors lived and protected with our lives. It doesn't belong to China. We, the indigenous peoples of Taiwan, have pushed this nation forward toward respect for human rights, democracy, and freedom. After thousands of years, we are still here. The national future of Taiwan will be decided by self-determination of the Taiwanese indigenous peoples and all the people who live in our motherland. No government, political party, or organization has the right to negotiate with any foreign power in an attempt to surrender the control of the traditional territory of ours, the indigenous peoples of Taiwan. We have never given up our rightful claim to the sovereignty of Taiwan. So, as I suggested earlier in the previous slide, the commission was using the language, or at least the regalia of indigenous ritual, to assert truth and reconciliation. Here we have indigenous people using language of self-determination, democracy, freedom, respect for human rights. So the language of the state and the language of NGOs to assert indigenous rights, right? So we see, again, this kind of multi-scalar, but also multi-directional articulation of transitional justice with rights for indigenous self-determination, and also an assertion of Taiwan's autonomy. So this was not an official statement of the commission. It was rather an informal statement signed by 26 out of the 28 members of the commission, a few other signees, and it was written by the late Lin Suya, a legal scholar who tragically passed away earlier this year in a freak accident on the Taichung MRT. It is no problem. Also significant for receiving international press attention. The New York Times wrote this up. The Apple Daily at the time also wrote it up, the late great newspaper as well. And this episode, along with Tsai's, very well publicized and very firm rebuke to Xi, saw her election fortunes turn around. It led to a real turnaround in the DPP's fortunes. But still, some indigenous critics were not impressed. Banai, pictured earlier protesting in front of Ketagalan Boulevard and still protesting today, years later, said the letter may as well have been addressed not to the Xi administration, but actually to the Tsai administration, which was less supportive of indigenous sovereignty and nation-to-nation relations than the Chen Shui-bian administration. So what we can see here is that there's a whole lot of ambiguity and polysemy as well, multiple meanings in the articulation and practice of transitional justice. I was in Taiwan conducting research for much of this time, even though I was based in Singapore as faculty there. And I kept hearing these statements all over the place at any kind of indigenous event or conference. If we want transitional justice, we need to do this. So, for example, I went to an event at Zhengda, and I saw that you have a sign just outside for Zhengda for supporting this Taiwan Studies Center. Yeah. So Zhengda, National Zhengzhi University was hosting a conference on indigenous land policy and environmental management. And this was a time when transitional justice had a lot more cachet. It was a way to argue for really anything you thought Taiwan should do. I heard one scholar say, to realize transitional justice, we should observe certain articles in the 2005 Indigenous Basic Law. So basically just follow our own rules, just do stuff the way we said we would. Don't fall short. That's transitional justice. Another person suggested that restoring farmland in Dulan in Taidong County and Amis area that had been spoiled by irresponsible agricultural policy, so basically just managing land better, that's transitional justice. A third person suggested that knowing the truth of the dispossession of ancestral lands in 1895 would also be transitional justice. So basically, it could stand in for anything. It was polysemic, it's a floating signifier. And it still had cachet, at least in 2019. Meanwhile, not just indigenous people, but also diasporic Taiwanese. So here by this I mean people born mostly to the descendants of Han settlers, maybe mixed with indigenous, but primarily Han settlers and their children in North America started writing about transitional justice in quite hopeful ways as well. So in 2019, from Ketagalan Media, which has now resurrected a weekly report, I strongly recommend that you subscribe to it. This is a media outfit based in California, run by Taiwanese Americans. The author Jenny Wong writes, watering the roots overseas Taiwanese and transitional justice. She suggests that memories of what life was like during the White Terror still linger in the hearts and minds of those Taiwanese Americans who were impacted. The creation of a unified Taiwanese narrative will help galvanize the Taiwanese to confidently and unapologetically work towards building their nation together. You see, again, this term spans indigenous to diaspora. Another voice, Catherine Zhou, who's now co-authoring a book that should be out hopefully in the next year with the scholar Mark Harrison. It should be a wonderful primer that would be very useful for future classes, writes in TaiwaneseAmerican.org that the Taiwanese Revolution has no single declaration of independence, but rather dozens. And these include the establishment of a Transitional Justice Commission, so far unfulfilled promises to indigenous communities, and so on. So again, we see transitional justice serving all kinds of storytelling. So what is it actually that transitioned? What actually happened through all of this, at least legislatively? Well, the commission dissolved a year ago, May 30th, 2022, and released a long report. They overturned nearly 6,000 sentences that had been passed in error, at least by their understanding of error. Of course, there's a lot of things that cannot be overturned. Executions that were ordered at the highest level of Taiwan society, those cannot be overturned, but they can be partially compensated. So a legislative bill was passed to compensate the family of each victim with about 380,000 euros. Not that much for someone who's been executed, but it's better than nothing at this point. But still, it's sort of what Wu Naida had decried as a victims without perpetrators approach. It's hard, no one's particularly blamed except for Chiang Kai-shek, who it turns out had signed death warrants of people that had been sentenced to much less. People who had been sentenced to maybe 5 or 10 years in prison, he would quite gratuitously require execution for. Meanwhile, despite that, his imagery and imagery of his son are still all over Taiwan. There's statues, street names, banknotes. I gave a talk just a month ago in Hsinchu, a Model UN talk on Jie Shou Lu, a street named for the longevity, for the long life of Chiang Kai-shek. So that still is all over the country. In fact, fewer than 30% of the statues have been removed. So a commission that actually had been empowered to really rethink Taiwan's public spaces, maybe to actually completely reformat the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall in Taipei, did much less than that. And so this, among other things, are critiqued quite stridently in a chapter I recommend you read, should you be interested in all of this, by Huang Chengyi, A Noble Dream Undelivered. And you can see the editorializing right there in the chapter title. And this is in a recent volume published by Günter Schubert and Ginny Lee in the Rutledge series. So, my own personal reflections, clearly the commission uncovered new informations. Some people are compensated. Some indigenous and domestic activists and diaspora activists formed new alliances. This is significant. And cultures of transitional justice, which had first been championed by scholar advocates, these affected Taiwan's narratives of history, and they started suffusing and permeating into other kinds of spheres. And one example of this, and forgive the self-promotion here, would be the book that Astrid so kindly was plugging. This would be Transitions in Taiwan, Stories of the White Terror. I mention this not only because my name is on the cover, and it was really an honor and a very humbling honor to work on this book, because this is a history that is not my own. It's not my family's history, and I had to approach it with as much humility as possible. But I mention this in particular because it was supported by the National Museum of Taiwan Literature, and more particularly by the National Human Rights Museum, which is its physical spaces are in former prisons. And these stories, I think, are very useful to show that the violence of the White Terror permeated so much of Taiwan society in ways that are not obvious, in ways that didn't involve necessarily the spilling of blood, but other forms of exploitation, dislocation, and repressed memory. And so the very first chapter by Judy Ensign, translated by Sylvia Lin, who I just mentioned, and Howard Goldblatt, addresses a political prisoner who had been locked up for several decades, finds himself out of jail and recovering his memories, recovering his relationships with his kids and grandkids, showing the elapsing of time, and basically the impossibility of recovering a past that had been robbed of you. It's a quite touching and terrifying story. The second story, The Taste of Apples, which addresses more actually the relationship between Taiwan and the US, Taiwan's implication in Cold War geopolitics that led to all kinds of perverse outcomes in Taiwan, where the best a peasant can hope for is to be run over by a US car and then to be compensated for the rest of his life for his injury. This is a very dark allegory. It's not even strictly a domestic issue, but it shows how Taiwan is often caught up in forces beyond its control. The third story, which I translated about exploitation of farmers in the south of Taiwan. There's very little blood spilled in this story. It's mostly a lot of cheating, a lot of factionalism, and a lot of theft at all levels, which again was able to proliferate in an atmosphere of suspicion and repression. A fourth story, Dixon's Idioms by Huang Chongkai, the youngest author in this collection, a quite touching story about a political prisoner on Green Island who got through his imprisonment by reading books by the English teacher Dixon, who himself was teaching English in the US to refugees, to political exiles, and learned and taught English as a form of political empowerment. So in this case, this shows again Taiwan's enmeshment in transitional networks. Chapter 5, Beef Noodles, which I'll talk about with some slides shortly. Disappearing Manhood by Wu Jinfa, basically about a man who becomes a bird to fly away, kind of a form of escape, a flight mechanism. And finally, a story by Wu He, who apparently is very hard to reach. And it's a very hard story to wrap one's head around, but it's about the kinds of repression that take place through military training, which was mandatory throughout that period in Taiwan. So I'd like to just talk briefly about one of the authors here and plug probably one of the most important writers in Taiwan still working, Li Ang, a pioneering feminist, the author of The Butcher's Wife, The Lost Garden, and much more. She writes really quite vividly, quite richly, quite violently. She studied theater at the University of Oregon, taught at Chinese Culture University, and was involved very early on in the Dangwai movement, in the non-KMT, outside the party activism. In fact, she gave money to a predecessor to the DPP and was quite close with Liu Xiaolian, Annette Liu, later to be Taiwan's first female vice president and really a pioneering feminist activist. This story is wonderful to teach with and to read, to think about Taiwan's both history of state violence, but also its identity. And so it begins in a political prison that may very well be the site of the National Human Rights Museum in Jingmei. It may very well be based on the founder of the DPP, who had been Li Ang's boyfriend at some point, Shiming, pictured here on his way to trial. An unnamed prisoner, the story begins, feels regret for not buying a bowl of beef noodle soup, which was a delicacy that they could enjoy in prison and would be something that they would buy for people on their last day before they'd be executed. It was a final gift that would be given to prisoners on death row. So he feels guilty about this, and he thinks that beef noodles are a dish from mainlanders. He thinks that it's a dish brought from Sichuan. From the southwest of China, because it's spicy, it's made with beef. Beef was not really eaten in Taiwan. Cows were seen more as work animals rather than as food animals. So he assumed this was something basically Chinese. And I think this is a common misunderstanding among people in Taiwan even to this day. And so this story has very, very vivid, very bloody descriptions of the prison, as well as the production of this dish. And after he's cleared, after he's released from prison, he travels to China and he can't actually find this dish. He goes all over Sichuan, and in fact, beef noodles are nowhere to be found. I've done this myself, tried to find beef noodles there. They're not there. There's wonderful food in Sichuan, but not Taiwan beef noodles. And he discovers that actually beef noodles are uniquely Taiwanese. They weren't made by mainlanders, but in Taiwan, probably somewhere around Kaohsiung in the 50s, using some tastes and memories of home, but to make a uniquely hybrid dish. And so this dish, in this way, for this prisoner and for this story, in some ways starts standing in for Taiwan, right? It's a hybrid dish for a hybrid nation, for a hybrid people, delicious, yet a bit bloody all the same. So it's a wonderful, wonderful story to read and think with. Liang, when she began writing, her work was really controversial, both for these kinds of political, but also these feminist themes. And she was quite aware of it and quite surprised to finally later win some recognition and some awards. And she was quite clear that what her work was doing was rethinking the role of the writer, in transitioning her own psyche, but also in transitioning representations of politics and of Taiwan. And she wrote in this award acceptance speech in 2012, I think a quite touching thing to keep in one's mind. We have always known about intelligence units such as the Garrison Command. When we were young, we were taught to have ears but no mouths. What's more terrifying is that for a long time, we established an invisible Garrison Command in our hearts. We think we know where the red line is, and then we set our constraints accordingly. Culturally, we are taught a set of traditional Chinese culture with fixed morals and standards. This forms another kind of Garrison Command in our hearts. Garrison Command here was the main apparatus of state repression, the one that was rounding up political prisoners and so on. And so her work is kind of meant to decolonize that through work on culture. And this work continues whether or not it's called transitional justice and whether or not it's done by the state. Probably the most recent filmic representation, I don't know if you've screened this or have any interest, but this just came out last year, Untold Her Story, about female political prisoners in Green Island, directed by Zero Cho, just came out last year. The producer, Pasuya Yao, a politician himself, has just been screening it in Australia in the last week or two. I wouldn't be surprised if there was some push. Okay.
In February.
All right. Yeah, I have mixed feelings about this film. I actually translated Zero Cho's first two feature films into English, the subtitles and scripts. It's interesting to see her twists and turns. Splendid Float, really quite an incredible film, and Spider Lilies, winning a Teddy Bear Award in Berlin. This one, we can talk about it because the talk is just about over. And I'm curious actually how you all liked the film, and I'm very happy to have some discussion with you now about today's talk, about the stories and everything else. Thank you.
Your question. Who went to see the film in February? Because it was actually, hundreds went. Because it was actually interesting. It was organized by a Taiwanese organization in Vienna. And one of the organizers was obviously friends with Zero Cho. So she also came.
Beautiful cinematography. I have some questions about the script. It seemed like it was very much addressing a contemporary political moment. But again, this shows how instrumental historical memory is. How many people showed up at the screening? Was it a popular event?
It was not there.
Yeah, it was full. Okay.
Yes.
And about how much of the room was Taiwanese and how much was otherwise?
More Taiwanese.
Yeah.
Much more.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was kind of difficult to go into the festival. It was or it was at the same time as the festival, but it was somehow separate. There were some Hong Kong people involved as well who came from Berlin, so it was an interesting setup. But it was a lot of Asian people and more than Austrian people. But I was also kind of especially confused about the ending, or maybe not confused, but kind of irritated by the ending, which shows all the people that have been harmed, who are dead, in fact, coming back to the shore and the beach and having a party.
Yeah.
And this is really what transitional justice in Taiwan, for at least a certain time, was. Let's forget this, don't bring it up, we can be happy together. At least it was I thought it was an interesting thing, but the ending was like, oops.
Yeah, a bit romantic in a almost religious kind of way. I mean, I use this as a final slide here in some ways, again, to evoke that initial slide. All these scenes basically of right, this slide here is similar enough to that film promotion still, right? And this similar kind of setup is also pictured in this performance. So this sense of being roped down, facing guns is still salient, you know, at whatever scale, unfortunately.
No questions. What do I have to
There's one to your left. Yeah.
So my question is about cost-based relations.
Yeah.
Because I'm very interested in, as growing up here in Vienna, and even though the comparison is not very easy or not very scientific, say, hey, Germany and South Africa and Taiwan, you have identities crafted through traditional justice or through the reconciliation process. And you have a modern understanding of what Taiwan means, not from the indigenous, complicated, multifaceted angles that you have described. But since we all know that the whole idea of Taiwan as a sovereign state or identity is something, one of the very few things that the CCP really does not want to see, I would be interested in how much the pursuit of transitional justice worsens and affects the cross-strait relations, especially now knowing that in January the elections can have very repercussions on this whole topic. And maybe you can elaborate, because I think a lot of people think about this topic.
Yeah, I mean, to my knowledge, the PRC leaders haven't directly spoken about Taiwan's transitional justice activities, right? Whenever they refer to Taiwan's leaders, they refer to them in very diminutive, kind of pejorative terms. They talk about them as Taiwan authorities or Taiwan's so-called presidents or so-called leaders and so on. I haven't seen any indication. I suspect they were monitoring what was happening, but I don't think they spoke about it. What I think is clear enough is that if one takes the argument that my sister and I made, that transitional justice wasn't just about Taiwan's own domestic policymaking, but was also about performing distinction from China, one could argue that it had, in some ways, it served a cross-strait policy purpose, even if it wasn't said to do so. And I think that is consistent with Tsai's general championing of Taiwan as democratic. If you watch the recent 10/10 National Day celebration, where Taiwan's leaders basically went over their goals and achievements of the last year, there was a lot about Taiwan's success in COVID, Taiwan's being, you know, one of the only major economies in the world to actually grow during the pandemic and not. But about half of the evocation of Taiwan was about democratic Taiwan, on and on about Minzhu Taiwan. And the world's a better place because of Minzhu democratic Taiwan. And this again is drawing distinction from China. So this is not going to be something that the PRC is going to directly take aim at beyond just more or less doubling down on the usual rhetoric of Taiwan's leadership is legitimate, Taiwan is culturally Chinese, Taiwan belongs to China, and so on. So I think if one wants to think strategically about the effects of this transitional justice policy on Taiwan's coming election and what that has to do with cross-strait policy, one could argue that the most successful, and this is something Huang Chengyi does in that chapter I mentioned, probably the most successful outcome of the transitional justice agenda was not the commission I'm talking about, but the other commission against ill-gotten assets, which did effectively freeze the KMT's assets and unwind a whole lot of them. This has led to arguably a fair electoral contest. It hasn't led to the erasure of the KMT as a party. In fact, they did quite well in the 2018 election. If they can get their act together in this current election and join forces with the third party, perhaps they have a fighting chance. But if it does actually freeze out the KMT, not just their money, but also entrench the DPP further in power, it may have further cross-strait implications.
Yeah, and also because the census about the identity of Taiwan, who identifies as Taiwanese, Chinese, or both, right? In 2014, 2017 or something, there was a huge shift between like 60% against both, only then 20% against both. And most of the time when we speak about this, it feels like we're from a democratic 4-year term vision, right? Where we think about the kind of quick developments that we see in parties, legislature, and so on. But if I'm the CCP and I know that I can like plan a bit longer and understand a bit more, okay, if the next generation of Taiwanese people have absolutely strongly in their hearts now the complete opposite narrative of I'm not Chinese, the foreign ministry or whoever is responsible for this type of question in CCP might actually try to really make it a subject maybe for the future. But
yeah, I mean, this is part of why the PRC won't communicate with DPP administrations, even though the DPP has policy that it looks like are not that different from the KMT, asserting maintenance of the status quo, not changing the names, and so on. It's not that different on paper than what the KMT was saying under Ma. But their cultural policy has been very different, as you're signaling, and this is perhaps part of the PRC's distrust and unwillingness to speak with them and efforts to influence elections in other ways.
yeah,
Yeah.
Thanks.
Two questions. So the first question is based on the presentation. Second is based on your introduction. So on the presentation, you spent maybe it's half of your presentation about the transitional justice, more about indigenous people. Then you turn to the literature.
Right.
Yes. Here is a question. So just to know, this question has 2 parts. Is the romanization of indigenous language a part of the transitional justice? Since I hear you're teaching culture, linguistic, and literature. So just want to know firstly, so if the romanization, so the preservation of indigenous language is a part of transitional justice. If it's yes, so the experts as you are you active so also to research to create the structure of this romanization of indigenous language?
So, thanks for the question. So, romanization of indigenous languages in Taiwan has been an ongoing process of many decades. In fact, some of the development of the romanizations have been pursued not by indigenous activists, but often by missionaries, right? And this is typical not just in Taiwan, but around the world, where the first people to develop writing systems are often Christian missionaries of some kind. So the creation of romanization systems is well underway. I think more important when it comes to state policy is the recognition and use of them. So indigenous people, like all people in Taiwan for many decades, were forced to use Chinese characters in their names. This has been extremely annoying for international people who don't have Chinese names as well, that they have to do this, but particularly annoying for indigenous Taiwanese who have been there much longer, can write their names in other ways, and then have to be using these names they don't identify with. So the push to permit Romanized names on official IDs and other places that people have to use their names precedes transitional justice as an institutional form in Taiwan. It goes back pre-2016. But post-2016, there's an additional impetus, there's additional ammunition, you could say, for accelerating the uptake and spread of these non-Chinese names. Yeah, as far as developing new romanizations, I can't speak to any new schemes that exist post-2016, except to say there is that much more state support, be it through not things named as transitional justice, but other sorts of agencies. So Indigenous Affairs Commissions, Indigenous TV, Indigenous media support, and so on, that will lend more and more pedagogical resources for the teaching of Indigenous languages, preservation, or in fact, reconstruction, and also for the support of Indigenous literature, written in Indigenous languages, not just in kind of a Chinese border translated kind of way. Yeah.
The second question, first of all, your sample production, you said before you went to Taiwan, you spent time also in Singapore.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's here Singapore. Singapore recognized, I think, so Malay as its own, their own national language, and in the meantime, recognize other foreign languages, so which are Chinese Mandarin, English, Tamil, in the meantime, Malay. And so this is another linguistic policy. I think so. you have surely some experience with it. Just to know more from your experience, did this reality in Singapore influence somehow later your translation career in Taiwan?
Yeah, so just a point of clarification, I was faculty in Singapore from 2017 to 2022. I lived in Taiwan well before that. So I first lived in Taiwan from like 15 years earlier, and Singapore came later. Singapore is sandwiched in the middle. As to how Singapore, I guess your question is, how did time in Singapore affect my understanding of Taiwan, perhaps, or language policy or race? I mean, a huge difference between Taiwan and Singapore, there's so many differences. In some ways, Singapore today politically is kind of like Taiwan in the 1980s. There's a party state that is disentangleable. The People's Action Party has elections, it wins all the elections. Taiwan had elections, the KMT won all the elections. Singapore has a father-son dynastic dynamic. Taiwan under the KMT had that kind of dynamic. All media outlets were tools of the party state in KMT, in martial law Taiwan, more or less the same as Singapore today. So there's actually a whole lot to compare. When it comes to race and ethnic policy, a huge difference now is that Taiwan has a discourse of indigeneity. Singapore has no discourse of indigenous, right? There are Malay people who will argue, I think with good reason, that they are the indigenous peoples of Singapore. The party state doesn't talk about it that way. They talk about it instead in terms of race, such that it's on Singaporean people's ID cards, right? You're either Chinese, Malay, Indian, or other, right? There's not an indigenous versus non-indigenous category. And in fact, still in the main, most visible public spaces of Singapore, you still see the Stamford Raffles, the colonizer, there in a way that Taiwan, which has more of a decolonizing or post-colonial discourse, if not necessarily realization, does not adhere to. So really quite different approaches to managing race, ethnicity, and so on, even if they both kind of use race as a tool of governance.
And this kind of difference influence somehow your reflection when you have to create your translation.
When I have done translations myself, literary translation, I don't know if my time in Singapore has really affected the way I translate into English. I mean, perhaps some uses of language. In Singapore, people say Huayu, right? They use that term to refer to Mandarin. In Taiwan, I use that term as well. But that term Huayu versus Guoyu, and I'm just talking about a translation of a particular word, right? A word for Chinese language, has political implications that are slightly different in Taiwan than they would be in Singapore. So I suppose it's nuanced my understanding of race, nation, language, and country, but it hasn't done that in a way that's transformed my translation practice, I would say, just for specific terms.
That completely love it, right? That was English. So I remember from the research, taking bus is slowly, it always stop. This is a kind of Singlish with a grammar which not really present in English. So from your experience in Singapore, you live sociolinguistically, so this impact. Does this experience influence somehow later?
The most I can say about this, it affected my English. I started using words like can to answer every question, right? Or appending what as a particle at the end of sentences. So yeah, it affected my English. And also, I will say I heard more Hokkien in Singapore than I did in Taipei. I mean, I live in Yilan now. I work in Taipei. I hear Hokkien or Minanyu, Taiyu all the time in Yilan. I don't hear it much in Taipei among people under 50. I guess it affected my Hokkien to that extent.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Question because is that for example, the realization of the indigenous names is seen as transitional justice, so about the question of when in your do you propose that transitional justice started with Tsai Ing-wen in Taiwan? No.
So the discourse of transitional justice started in the 2000s with publications by these scholars, as I mentioned, and the NGO. It was like Minjian is a civil association for transitional justice.
Acts that were set up for kind of recompensation.
Yeah, in the 90s. Yeah, in the 90s under Li Denghui, there were efforts. There's also the establishment of the 228 Museum, right? Some compensation, yeah, but it was typically not talked about as transitional justice. So that word again becomes a floating signifier later. It's a historical entity. And so again, this is why I could say, for example, Untold Her Story. It doesn't use the language of transitional justice, but it is using similar kinds of imagery and similar tactics inherited from that, even if it's not that word. So like my book, for example, it's supported by the Human Rights Museum. It was not supported by the Transitional Justice Commission, but the word transitions is there in the title. I didn't necessarily want it that way. This is something the publisher wanted, right? But it's now a discourse that it can be slotted into. Yeah. Yeah.
Justice. I'm not a big expert in Taiwan, actually. But I have to ask these programs. If I'm not mistaken, Taiwan is a member of Amnesty International, and the thing I would like to clarify for myself is how effective these programs in Taiwan. What's actually the reaction on the Chinese authorities to these programs and their actions?
So Taiwan has become a hub for a number of regional NGOs as well as journalists that can operate in China. How effective is Amnesty globally? I mean, it really depends on particular campaigns. They have done effective advocacy work in various places. Taiwan has long been a center for advocacy for freeing Tibet, or at least reducing repression on Tibet. Activists within Taiwan who worked in Amnesty, for example, Freddie Lim, the death metal entrepreneur turned politician, used to work at Amnesty, became legislators, have had all kinds of political impacts. The work of NGOs in Taiwan, any NGO has its successes, has its failures. That Taiwan can provide a service for the region has made it in some ways a pilgrimage site, a site of training, and a site of education for activists everywhere from Japan to Thailand to Myanmar. A number of other, for example, LGBT movements have found a lot of comrades to organize within Taiwan. So, one can pick and choose which NGOs they prefer. One can like certain things Amnesty has done or not. But I think it's clear enough if one looks at the history of Taiwan in the last 20 years that it's become a pretty important place for all kinds of social movement, organization, and scholarship. I hope that answers your question. As far as it becoming a place for other kinds of activism or reporting, I will say a huge change in the last 5 years has been a whole relocation of journalists from China to Taiwan. So now, for example, the New York Times, Bloomberg, The Economist, they can't have their journalists working in China. China is denying them visas or making their lives basically impossible. And Taiwan has, for all of its other difficulties in internationalization, and I can speak about that working there. It has at least been a much more open home for these kinds of writers. Yeah.
And how Chinese authorities behave in this situation? Just ignore it.
Yeah, ignore it or decry troublemaking. Yeah, but they can't do much. I mean, there's various counterintelligence activities. Various surveillance happening in Taiwan, no doubt, but they can't do much more than complain about it. I haven't heard them complain about Taiwan harboring journalists. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
Ask
question.
question, is that, uh, I have a question for instead. How do you think the Taiwanese government should behave in this situation? Because it seems that they are not really engaging in the dialogue. 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 They are not really engaging in the dialogue
the Transitional Justice Commission exonerated more than 5,000 people,
Yeah.
and I want to ask what the focus there is. When they exonerate people, does the president have to say if they're out of prison, or does the parliament?
So these people have are pretty much all out of prison or have died. So it's a posthumous kind of exoneration or it's more of a rehabilitation. Basically, it announces that the verdicts were passed in error, that these people committed no crime, and that their families and their friends and whoever else should hopefully feel at peace about this. So the commission did this themselves. They are empowered to do so. I don't think the president had to sign this into effect, to sign a pardon. It's an exoneration, but it may perhaps too little, too late for a lot of people. Yeah.
There were exonerations before that.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the 90s too. In the 90s too, even I think we don't play as well. Yeah. Yeah. But the acts of the commission, you know, came later. Yeah.
What's the current state of the KMT file archive transparency? Because you said that they were like open the vaults to many of these files, but just as in Eastern Germany, I can imagine this process is very hard. In my research, I also read a lot about this and how difficult this is,
Yeah.
how socially unique this is to each country.
Yeah, I think a lot disappeared. A lot was never recovered, but as much as could be recovered as quickly as possible.
Because now, because if you recover all these files, the KMT or the ROC actually has, then you go prior to 1945, 1949. So even to now change the narrative of Tsai Ing-wen to all of the files that the KMT took with them from the main. I'm just interested in the process of how they decide what to do about it. Because in Germany, they just gave it all, they just published it all to the private people who were flying off with that already. Now, this is a very, very bold move. And as we can see that Taiwan internationally and domestically is a bit more political of a situation, socially, politically, I can imagine this to be very, very exciting and very, very important topic right now. But I did not find so much information on it, and I didn't have any conversation about other teachers. So,
yeah.
Anything about what's going on?
So the archives that could be found, as I understand it, were found by the commission, dissected by a number of historians. The commission had a number of practicing historians on it. And did as much work as they could and reported on that. But a whole lot of stuff was disappeared. The KMT had stuff that they had years and years behind this, even before the commission was announced. So there's certainly stuff we don't know and we'll never know. Yeah.
Wow.
About the KMT assets, they frozen, and after that nationalized, or what exactly happened?
They have been, I wish I could tell you in greater detail. The Huangtangi chapter has a whole lot more, but most of them have been frozen or taken back or being unwound. The most colorful thing I can tell you is based on someone who is supporting that commission, who told me she flew to Palau, that a resort in Palau was owned by a KMT investment vehicle, and then that was frozen. I think a lot of this work is still, as I understand it, it's mostly frozen rather than back in state coffers, but it's money that can't be accessed by the KMT now. Money and properties. I can't tell you more than that. I'm unfortunately not an expert on this particular.
From what I've heard, this issue of neatly delineating what exactly is KMT.
Yeah, it's extremely hard.
What was states, ROC.
Yeah.
So, for example, I've been to school in Belgium.
Yeah.
That's owned by the Ministry of Education or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Yeah.
ROC, but obviously historically it was probably run by the KMT. So what happened there?
I don't know about that. I don't know about the case in Belgium. Yeah, I couldn't tell you about that particular case. I'm quite curious myself. I know that commission made just to illustrate the difficulty of your question, has made a board game to visualize the reach and also the difficulty of untangling all that stuff. So I can't tell you much more. I would just point you to the Huangtangi chapter. Yeah.
Well, now that we have somewhat somewhat successfully dissected the society from the Taiwanese society and identity, maybe from KMT and authoritarian past. But now politically, as you just said, the flag of the ROC is still the KMT flag. We still have so many streets and names, especially as totally distinct. Would you say that there is now near the end of the second term of the DPP and Tsai Ing-wen, and now the upcoming elections, is there a growing, because you live there, right? Is there a growing sentiment now to push for more like differentiation, with the dissection between state and KMT or ROC and KMT?
I mean, the Tsai administration has so successfully appropriated ROC imagery as it's forged a new kind of consensus that Taiwan is effectively independent already. The name of the state is the ROC. There's no push to change the flag or anything else. She's made this promise in both elections. Her current successor, her likely successor, should he win, has said he would continue those same policies. So even though this is absolutely dissatisfying to the Deep Greens who this commission might have hoped to mollify, that is more or less a mainstream enough position. And most Taiwanese, even if they might grumble about this, if they're not thrilled about this, if they don't like, for example, being represented as Chinese Taipei, would vote for that as a conservative show of prudence and caution, rather than risk something more provocative in this coming election. Most people I know, most of my students, but I'm in a peculiar department. I'm in a department called Taiwan Culture, Language, and Literature, are not fans of these ROC symbols. But if you were to look at broader opinion polls and the like, there's no push for a radical or drastic change in this when there's a military threat counterweighted against it.
So this caution, this national security caution, also affects the media, the wider populace, in their humbleness, let's say, of changing and further pursuing and pushing the institutionalization.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think so. Will you change after the martial law? So how could you represent social linguistically this change of rhetoric of point in your translation? Do you have any particular strategy to create for your translation this kind of tension or this kind of reform change?
How the language has changed. I mean, there are certain orthographic conventions in the past, like if you were to write Chiang Kai-shek's name, you would have to put a space after it. When it comes to representing that in English, there's various strategies one can use. There's also questions of what kind of romanization one should use. So I'm not translating it myself, but I've commissioned a translation of a book set in the martial law period by Lai Xiangyin, who is recently presenting this book in Frankfurt. The question of whether to use Wade Giles, whether to use Hanyu Pinyin, what kind of romanization is a political one. The question of what romanization to use in Taipei versus other parts of Taiwan was a political one during the mayorship of Ma Ying-jeou, which coincided with Chen Shui-bian's presidency, right? So this is something that informs the way I would translate, absolutely. And it's an ongoing negotiation. I don't have a straightforward answer to it. Yeah. I'm erring for now when it comes to representing materials written or set during the White Terror, to using Wade Giles just for historical accuracy.
So this tension can be realized when readers are just so.
Yeah, and ideally with the introductory or prefatory note, it can explain a bit to the reader who's not necessarily proficient in Chinese what's going on behind the scenes in the translator's calculation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So everybody is satisfied, hopefully. May I ask you to return all the papers that I circulated about the forthcoming events to the front? And then we all wish to thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. It's great to meet you all.
We are really looking forward to the next opportunity. And wish you a few nice days.
Thank you. Thank you so much.